Chapter 3. Wenatchee was the biggest town around, but if it weren't really much of a town at all, Miller Road was the only real street, and it was just a dusty dirt track winding through sagebrush and boulders. All the people lived at their homesteads and orchards out amongst the brown hills and rocky canyons. Sorry, I feel really sleepy today. The town itself was only a few buildings, a hotel, a couple of houses, a government building for filling claims and such. At the end of this little cluster of wooden buildings was my destination, the Miller Freer Trading Post. The trading post was never much to look at. A shabby little low building with a couple of grimy windows and a saging roof. I shook my head and cursed softly when I saw it, but not because it was small and plain. I cursed because I knew right off that what I was after weren't there. There were no horses tied up at the rail out front. The corral around back was empty. It was the same story at the few other buildings that made up the town of Wenatchee. Ezra Bishop was gone, and my sorrow with him, disappointment, hit my heart like a snake bite. But my feet didn't slow. They sure enough sped up. I weren't gonna give up, and the more behind I fell, the faster I'd have to catch up. I strode right up toward the door. I was so set on what I had to do, I didn't even see the body sitting silent on the ground, leaned up against the trading post's long walls in the shadows of the roof overhang. I jumped back, startled when two legs shifted in the dust to keep me from tripping on them. Lawyer, I'm sorry. My words cut off when I seen his face. He was a Chinese, and just a boy, not any older than me, and maybe a bit younger. He blinked at me, and I could tell I'd just woken him up. He pulled his legs up quick to his chest and turned his head away, like maybe he was afraid I was gonna hit him. I'd seen Chinese before, of course. There were plenty of them in the country, mining and panning for gold, once the railroads were mostly built. They kept to themselves, though, and I'd never seen one up close. It's all right, I said quickly. I just didn't see you there, is all. His face stayed pointed away from me. He was breathing and blinking fast, and I could see the nervous swallowing in his throat. He sure enough looked scared. I looked up and down at the road again, but I didn't see any sign of more Chinese. Sorry, I said again, and walked past him into the trading post. The light was dim through the dirty windows. Mr. Miller was sitting on a barrel behind a rough counter. Sacks and crates and boxes of goods were piled all about. Hello, sir. Mr. Miller spit a stream of dirty brown tobacco juice into a bucket at his feet and lifted his chin at me. Morning. Did a man named Ezra Bishop stop here last night or this morning? Mr. Miller nodded and moved the chaw around in his mouth. Yep, when did he leave? Mr. Miller squinted thoughtfully, then shrugged. Sometime last night, I suppose, around sunset. I didn't stop long. Got some coffee and flour, asked around a bit about horses. Then he was gone. What's he want the horses for? Mr. Miller shrugged again, then laid down a spit. You know where he's headed? Which way he went? Mr. Miller jerked his head back over his shoulder in a vaguely southward direction. Said something about Walla Walla. Took off down Rhode Island way last I saw. Walla Walla? My heart dropped. Walla Walla was clear across the state. A couple 100 miles, I reckon. My hands went all sweaty and my belly tightened. I felt like I could feel my Sarah being dragged farther and farther out of my reach. I licked my lips and shifted restless from foot to foot. How do you suppose he's gonna get there? Mr. Miller had never been one for conversation, and I could tell he was getting good and bored with our talking. He scowled and screwed his eyes up at me. Heck, boy, I didn't know up and over Clockham and down through Robert Roast, I suppose. 'Tain't no concern of mine, and it probably ain't none of yours tonight. You here to buy some, or just to jaw at me all morning? No, sir. I appreciate your help. I was backing toward the door when I remembered the boy outside. Who's the boy out front, sir? Mr. Miller grimaced. What, the Chinaman? He's still there? He shook his head and spit. Chinaman? I heard the word in my mind. Then my mama's voice. I'd said it once, the year before, after we'd passed a few of Chinese on the road to Yakima. I don't like that word, Joseph, she said. It's an ugly word, and I don't want you saying it. I've been confused. Everyone called them Chinamen. I didn't know there was another word for him. It ain't a curse word, Mama, I argued. She pursed her lips. Any word can be an ugly word if you say it ugly. And people say that word ugly, Joseph, nearly every time. It sounds hateful, and I don't like it. They're people just like us. At the end of the day, in the Lord's eyes, if not in his people. Mama had always been my measure of goodness, and always would be. I hadn't said Chinaman since. That ain't no man, I answered Mr. Miller. He's just a boy. Where's his people? Under a few feet of dirt and rocks, he said, matter-of-factly. Kim and a couple of grown ones limped into town 3 days ago. The others were sick as dogs, died for sunset. Not sure of what. I stared at him. So he's all by himself? He ain't got no family or nothing? Nope. He's been sitting here like that ever since he showed up 3 days ago. Must be hungry as a bear. My belly dropped down to the rough board floor. You mean he ain't eaten in 3 days? You didn't give him no food? Give? I ain't in the business of giving away food, boy, especially to Orientals. Another Chinaman will happen along here any day, I suppose. They can take care of him. What if one don't, though? Mr. Miller fixed me with an out of all patience stare. 'Tain't no concern of mine, he drawled slowly. Them's words you oughta start learning yourself, boy, especially if you aim to track down Ezra Bishop. You go after him looking for trouble, you'll find it for certain. Now, you buying or you leaving? There was sure enough a lot swirling around in my heart. In my head at the moment, I was pulled every which sort of way. There was the boy out there alone. There was my girl Sarah getting whipped away from me. There were all my own fears and doubts and loneliness piled up inside me. And as always, above all else, was my mama and papa. I tried to figure best as I could. What is it they would have me do? I reached into my satchel and pulled out a $10 note. I'm buying, sir. What you got in the way of ready-to-eat foods? When I stepped back outside, my satchel hung heavier on my shoulder. A tin canteen with a screw-top lid was slung over my other shoulder, full of water, seeing as I had plenty more walking ahead of me. I went over to the boy still sitting against the wall. He looked up at me, scared and breathless. I knelt down and held out a biscuit. He looked at it, then back up at me. His lips were white and cracked. I wonder if he'd had any water all the while he's been sitting here. I was darn near certain Mr. Miller hadn't brought him any. Go on, I said. Take it. I pulled the canteen off my shoulder and shook it off so he could hear the water, and unscrewed the lid and put it on the ground next to him. He gave me one more wide-eyed look, then snatched the canteen and gulped at it noisily. He stopped to take a breath and wiped his mouth with his sleeve, then timidly reached out and took the biscuit from my hand. It was gone in 3 bites and washed down with more water. He looked at me, panting. I smiled. Better? He winked at me. Then he wiggled and pulled some out of his pants pockets, and I held it in his open palm. I squinted down at it. It was a small carving, like a little statue made out of some kind of shiny black rock. It was in the shape of a bird, long kind of bird, like a crane or a heron, but it was small enough that he could have hit it if he'd closed his hand. He held it out to me and said a few scratchy words in Chinese. I didn't know a lick of what he was saying, but I could tell from the sound of his voice and the look in his eyes that he was asking me a question. I shrugged my shoulders helplessly. He said the words again, more intensely this time. Stretching to hold the bird closer to me so I could see it better. I'm sorry, I said, shaking my head. I don't know what you're saying. You speak any English? He just blinked at me again, then pursed his lips and slipped the little blackbird back into his pocket. I thought I could see tears welling up in his eyes. Okay, I said softly. No English. Well, I'll go ahead and talk anyways. I'm heading that way, I said, pointing south toward Rock Island. You're welcome to come with me. I got some food and I'm heading toward bigger towns with more Chinese, likely. You want to come? There was no flicker in his face, no sign he understood a plumb word of what I said. I stood up and screwed the lid back on the canteen. He sat stone still, looking up at me. I reckon I ain't never seen no one looking scareder than that Chinese boy sitting there all alone. I held out a hand down toward him. Come on, there ain't nothing for you here. I could see he was frozen. When you ain't got nowhere to go, I suppose it's easy to stay right where you are, no matter how awful. Come on, it'll be all right, you'll see. I saw the decision come closer right there in his eyes. His eyebrows crinkled for just a second, like he was getting ready to jump off a moving stagecoach, and then he reached up and grabbed hold of my hand. I pulled him up and got another biscuit out of my satchel while he beat the dust off his breeches. I handed him the biscuit, and he did some sort of nod, or how that looked an awful like, thank you. Don't mention it, I said, sticking out my hand. My name's Joseph Johnson. He just blinked at me and held his head way back like he thought I was going to hit him. Joseph, I said louder, thumping myself on the chest. Nothing. Joseph, I repeated, poking myself with a finger. Joseph. Then I held my hands out to him, waiting for him to say his name. The kid just blinked some more and then frowned. Look, we got a ways to go, you and me. We gotta at least be able to call each other something. I reached down and grabbed his hand. He flinched but didn't yank it back. I pulled his hand up and held it against my chest. Joseph, get it? Joseph. I dropped his hand and then pressed my own up to his chest. I could feel his heart beating through his thin black shirt, fast and hard like a scared rabbit's. I curled my eyebrows into question marks. You? Huh? You? The kid just stood there looking at me with his pounding heart and blank face. I dropped my hand with a sigh. All right, well, let's get a move on. A nervous storm brewed in my belly. My mission had already been a tough one. When I only had myself to worry about, adding a Chinese boy who didn't know a word of English to the mix weren't gonna make it easier. But I knew with a certainty that I'd done what my mama and papa would have wanted me to. I turned up the road and started walking. The Chinese boy fell in line, a step behind me. We walked off together to find the devil who had my horse. Okay, so one thing we know for certain is that we have a Chinese boy for certain. The chapter wasn't really short. It was pretty long, but I'm still gonna read chapter 4 anyways. Okay? And we'll see how it goes. Let's just turn you over. Chapter 4. We trudged along for hours without neither of us saying a word. Once we'd passed the few buildings of Wenatchee proper, the rocky dirt road mostly wound through sageland and orchids and around boulders near as big as houses. The blue water of the Columbia River sparkled off to our left, and pine-dotted hills rose up on our right. Here and there we'd seen a cabin or a lean-to where someone was trying to make a go of homesteading. A couple of folks passed us on horseback, and we had to get out of the way of one wagon. But for the most part, we had that wide open country of ourselves. It was warm for October, and I wiped at the seat on my forehead from time to time. My companion insisted on staying a good 5 or 6 steps in back of me. Also known as the Chinese boy. The few times I stopped so he could catch up, he just stopped too and looked sideways at me until I got to moving again. And then the road took a sharp turn to the right, straight up into the layered hills that I knew would take us over Clocum Pass and to the town of Ellensburg on the other side. It sure looked like a lot of hills and a lot of climbing. But there was nothing to do but put our heads down and start on up. The road through Clocum Pass felt even steeper going up than I remembered from coming down in it the previous spring with my papa. Whether my silent partner liked it or not, we had to struggle a fair bit together, helping each other up and catching each other when we'd slip. He seemed a little less scared by my touch each time. We grunted our way up the mud track for who knows how many hours. And by the time the sun was near to setting, we still had hill after hill lined up in front of us. Looking back down the way we'd come through, the river sure enough looked far off and small, so I knew we'd done some good traveling. The evening chill was already in the air, and dark was coming on quick. I reckoned it was time for making camp. At the top of the little rise, out on a point, overlooking the whole great river valley, I spied a little dry, protected spot tucked nice and neat under a big old rock, overhang from the cliff above. There was a ring of stones on the ground and black soot on the rock ceiling, so I knew I weren't the first to find it. I led my nameless partner over and dropped my satchel in the beat-down dirt under the overhang. "This is it," I said. "Home sweet home." He looked at me with his unreadable face, still breathing hard from the last hill. "Let's get us some wood." I walked off into the underbrush and scattered small pines looking for burning wood. My body was already starting to shiver, and I was eager as anything to get a good blaze going. Coming back into our camp, teetering under a load of wood, I noticed right off that the boy was gone. I dropped the wood and looked around him where he came, stumbling out of the fading light with his own armload of wood. He dropped it with a clatter where I dropped mine. Good, I patted with a nod. More. By the time we had a big enough pile to last the night, stars were starting to blink above us, and the sky was that dark kind of purple just before black. Together we hoisted a nice big log with a flat side over to our camp and set it so we could sit on it. Then I pulled the matches I bought from Mr. Miller out of my satchel and set to getting a fire going. Soon there was a crackling wood and cheerful yellow light and a more than welcome warmth of the crooked ring of stones. I found the seat on the log, and the Chinese boy sat on the other end, as far as he could from me, without falling off. The overhang was a cozy little shelter, safe from most of the breezes that blew through from time to time. And the stone wall behind us bounced the heat off the fire back at us, so we was pretty much warmed from both sides. We sat for a while, chewing at the apples and strips of jerky I took from my satchel. Tim, I don't know why I started talking. I guess maybe there's just something about sitting by a fire that makes a fella want to talk. I'm going to get my horse back, I said, staring into the twisting flames. The boy's head snapped up and he looked over at me sideways. Her name's Sarah. She's a 9-year-old filly, a red and white paint with a notch in one ear. Prettiest pony you ever saw. Fast and blazes too. She's half Indian pony, so she's got some spirit, but she ain't nothing but perfect with me. She turns before I even have to tell her. Mama always said it was like we had shared a heart, Sarah and me. The fire popped and hissed. Out somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight, an owl hooted. The boy took another bite of his apple, living with Mr. Grissom. I hadn't had a soul talk to. And I could sure enough feel all those dammed up words crowding to get out of me. Pa got it for me when I was 4, when she was just a yearling. So as we could grow up knowing each other. Had me up on her right way. I was riding her bareback by the time I was 5 and jumping fences when I was 9. I looked over at him. I don't suppose you ever had a horse? He just swallowed nervously and kept his eyes on the fire. I got up to throw another log onto the fire. I stood for a second by the wood pile, looking up at the sky. Stars were glittering here and there, with more sparkling up all the time. Sitting back down, he'd heard that some Indians think the stars... she'd heard that some Indians think the stars are the campfires of our ancestors. That once we die, we'd go up to join them and get a fire of our own. I knew a person who didn't speak a word of English. I figured speaking up wasn't all that important. When you die, you ain't got no matches or nothing with you. So she figured the fires must already all be lit by God, just waiting to welcome folks and give them up a warm place in heaven to sit. She always wondered which one was for her. I felt a little smile, just a little one, teasing at the corners of my mouth. But all the same time, I felt a lot wetness in my eyes. I tried to blink away so we'd always look up and pick out ours. We'd pick out which one was our campfire, waiting for us in heaven. My voice broke off, and I turned away, ashamed at the tears on my cheeks. Aww, that's sad. But once those words started coming, it was like there was no stopping them. It's funny, Pa and I made it all the way down this pass with the mud and the switchbacks and the hairpin turns. dragging a log to slow us the whole way, and fighting for every foot. And then the hill that kills him up over at Old Mission is plumb nothing. Like a little slope, really wouldn't hardly take your breath to walk it up. But the wagon just got a little away from us, and that wheel got stuck. And like that, he throws me clear, and I'm rolling down the hill, and he's stuck under that cursed wagon. I sniffed and wiped at my nose. It ain't fair. Ain't fair for him to go like that. After all we've gone through to get there. Ain't fair for him to go when I ain't got nothing or no one else left. Nothing but my horse. The tears were back and more than I could hold on to. I hid my face, but I couldn't keep my shoulders from shaking. And my breathing was loud and sniffling. I don't know what it was that got to me right then. Maybe it was all of it. The cold and the hunger and all the loneliness and all loneliness. Hold up. And the all aloneness. Okay, there you go. And shot right through. It was the feeling of my Sarah getting farther and farther away. I suppose sadness can sometimes be a storm that's easy to get lost in. I was surprised when I felt someone touching my shoulder. I looked through blurry eyes and saw that the boy had slid on over till he was right up against me. His face had the same blank expression, but I thought I could see, mixed up in it, a little bit of something else. Understanding, maybe. He reached round just once and gave my back a little pat. And then he started walking. Quiet at first, so quiet I could barely hear him. That Chinese talking came on in a scratchy whisper, shy and stumbling as it got started. He talked into the fire and the flames flickered in his eyes, and his voice got more strength to it. His words were like a song I didn't know the tune of, full of quick turns and drops. I just sat and listened, like he had for me. At some point, I realized he was crying, but only with his eyes. There weren't no shake of his voice, no sniffle to his breathing. His tears came down, silent like falling snow, and his talking never let up. I figured he must have had some words dammed up in him, too. I sure enough didn't know a word of what he was telling me, but I reckon I had to do with the same kind of stuff inside me, family and things that were lost, and having no place to call home. Maybe he was talking about his mama, however many thousands of miles away or dead even. Maybe he was talking about his pa, buried back in Wenatchee, or about some brother or sister he'd likely never see again. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the little carving he'd shown me earlier, that shiny black stone bird. He held it out to me while he kept talking, and I took it careful, turned it over to look at it, then handed it back to him. He slid it back into his pocket and wiped at his cheeks with his sleeve. I reached around him like he had to me and patted him on the back. He looked at me with a serious face and reached over and put his hand to my chest. "Joseph," he said. "What'd you say?" "Joseph," he said slowly, with a little nod. Then he grabbed my hand and pulled it up to his own chest. I could feel his heart beating just like before, but it weren't beating scared like a rabbit's anymore. "Aki," he said, thumping my hand soft against himself. "Aki. Aki," I repeated. He nodded and I nodded back. And then I smiled. I pulled my hand from his chest, but left it held out in front of him. He looked at it, then understood, and took it up from his own. We shook hands, sitting there, quivering shoulder to shoulder, on the mountainside with the campfires of our ancestors shining down on us. "Pleased to meet you, Aki," I said. Oh my gosh. That is like the saddest chapter well, not really the saddest, but the most emotional chapter. Because, or maybe chapters. Chapter 3 to chapter 4, you guys were just crazy. But chapter 4 was definitely one of my favorite ones because it really, like, I don't know how to explain it. It's just, it's, like I said before, it's emotional. And it's no longer inappropriate. Yeah, no longer inappropriate. But it's more crazy, like, more adventurous, you know? I feel really happy that Aki and Joseph got along. If they didn't get along, I would probably be heartbroken. So, let's give a little applause to this, even if we haven't finished this. And hope the best for Aki and Joseph. Bye. I will see you in the next 2 chapters.